The chess hall was filled with whispers and excitement as players gathered for the open tournament. Among them sat a shy woman named Alara, who quietly placed her wooden pieces on the board without drawing attention. She rarely spoke and often kept her gaze lowered as if she wanted to disappear in the crowd. Yet her hands moved with confidence that seemed to carry years of hidden practice. Across from her sat a man who was known to everyone in the hall, the arrogant Grandmaster Victor. He was feared by many for his skill, and even more for his sharp tongue that mocked opponents before they even had a chance to play. When he noticed Alara, he leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "So, they're letting amateurs in now," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. The players nearby chuckled nervously, not wanting to be the target of his ridicule. Alara said nothing. Her eyes remained on the board, as if she had not even heard him. Victor continued to mock her, whispering to others about how quickly this game would end. The clock was pressed, and the match began. Victor made his first move with exaggerated flair, slamming the piece down, as if declaring his dominance. Alara responded calmly, her hand moving smoothly to place her pawn with quiet precision. The audience expected her to stumble, but each move she made seemed sharper than the last. Victor leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, as if something about her play unsettled him. Still, he covered his unease with arrogance, laughing at her slowness, pretending he was in full control. But within minutes the board began to shift. Her moves formed patterns that only the most trained eyes could recognize. A trap was being woven quietly, patiently, and Victor was stepping right into it. The whispers in the hall grew as observers realized this was no ordinary woman. Some leaned closer, astonished by the unfolding strategy. Victor scoffed, but sweat began to gather at his temple. His mocking tone grew quieter as his pieces were slowly cornered. Alara remained silent, her face calm, as though the game were nothing more than a casual exercise. Move after move, Victor found himself forced into defense, his proud attacks collapsing like sand. The quiet woman, who no one expected to last 5 minutes, was now controlling the pace of the entire match. The room had fallen silent, every eye fixed on the board, every ear waiting for the sound of the next piece touching wood. Alara moved her queen with steady hands, placing it in a position that made the crowd gasp. Victor froze, his arrogant smile fading into disbelief. He looked at the board again and again, hoping to find an escape, but the walls of her strategy had already closed in. The hall trembled with anticipation as the once mocking Grandmaster struggled to breathe through the tightening pressure of her brilliance. Victor gripped the edge of the table, his fingers trembling as he tried to calculate a way out. Each second that passed felt heavier as the clock ticked down, mocking his hesitation. The once confident Grandmaster now looked like a student cornered by his own mistakes. Alara sat motionless, her eyes calm, steady, her breathing unshaken by the growing tension around them. The crowd leaned closer, holding their breath as if afraid to disturb the silence that had fallen over the hall. Victor finally moved a rook, desperate to shield his king, but his effort only tightened the snare. Alara raised her hand slowly and shifted a bishop across the board with delicate grace. The crowd gasped again, murmurs spreading like fire as they recognized the elegance of her plan. Victor pushed back in his chair, his face pale, the arrogance drained from his features. "You cannot be serious," he whispered under his breath, though no one answered. Alara did not speak. She only focused on the board as though nothing else in the world existed. Every move she made revealed another layer of her brilliance. The spectators who once laughed at Victor's mocking words now stared at Alara with awe. Whispers of genius and prodigy rippled through the hall like a rising storm. Victor wiped his brow and leaned forward again, his pride refusing to let him resign. He tried to launch another attack, swinging his knight forward with a sudden strike. Alara paused, her eyes flickering over the board as if she could see far beyond the present moment. Then, with a soft touch, she slid her pawn forward, a simple move, yet one that blocked every escape. The audience erupted in disbelief as they realized the trap was complete. Victor sat frozen, his lips pressed tight, his arrogance now replaced with silent fear. Alara looked up for the first time, meeting his eyes not with triumph, but with quiet certainty. Her presence alone seemed to weigh heavier than the entire room filled with spectators. The Grandmaster, who had mocked her so loudly, now could not even find the words to respond. Victor shifted in his seat, his hands restless, as he tapped the table, trying to mask his panic. The crowd had grown restless too, their eyes darting between the board and the faces of the two players. Every spectator could sense the shift of power. The arrogant Grandmaster was no longer in control. Alara rested her hand lightly on the clock, waiting for Victor to make his move, her patience unbroken. Victor leaned closer, studying the board with desperation, his mind racing for a miracle that refused to appear. He muttered calculations under his breath, but each path he followed ended the same. Alara had sealed his fate move by move with flawless precision. Finally, he pushed a pawn forward, but the move was weak. The crowd knew it the moment his fingers released the piece. Alara moved again, this time sliding her queen with measured grace, setting up a strike so clear that even the beginners in the audience could see it. A hush fell over the hall as the tension tightened around Victor like a rope pulling closed. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His confidence had drained away, leaving only disbelief. Alara sat still, her eyes never leaving the board, her silence heavier than any words she could have spoken. The Grandmaster, who once laughed at her, now stared at the pieces as though they had betrayed him. The audience leaned forward, waiting for what would come next, their breath shallow and quick. Every tick of the clock echoed louder, filling the room with a rhythm that matched Victor's rising dread. Alara raised her hand again, her fingers hovering above a piece, as the entire hall held its breath. Alara touched her knight, and with a steady motion placed it forward, locking Victor deeper into the trap. The sound of the piece settling on the board was like thunder in the silence of the hall. Victor's eyes widened as he leaned forward, staring at the position over and over, unable to believe what he was seeing. The whispers of the crowd turned into a low roar, people pointing at the board, excitement spreading like fire. Alara leaned back, her face calm, her hands resting gently in her lap, as if she already knew the outcome. Victor clenched his fists, his pride battling against the reality before him. He tried to smile, but it looked broken, forced, like a mask cracking under pressure. "You are just lucky," he muttered, but even he did not sound convinced. The spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others smiling in disbelief. Alara did not answer. She only waited, her eyes fixed on the board, her silence more powerful than any insult. Victor grabbed his queen, moving it aggressively, as if he could still turn the tide with sheer will. But the moment he released the piece, gasps echoed through the hall. The mistake was too obvious. Alara reached forward, her fingers light and precise, and slid her rook into place. The entire board shifted in an instant. The Grandmaster was cornered again. Victor froze, his breath caught in his chest as the weight of her move pressed down on him. The hall was silent, once more, every player, every spectator, knowing they were witnessing something unforgettable. Alara lowered her hand back to her side, her calm presence filling the room as Victor stared in disbelief at the trap that had closed tighter than before. Victor rubbed his temples, his eyes darting back and forth across the board as if searching for a door that no longer existed. The once mighty Grandmaster looked small beneath the weight of the position, his arrogance fading into silence. The crowd leaned so close it felt as though the entire hall was breathing together, waiting for what Alara would do next. Some of the younger players whispered to one another, their voices trembling with awe. "She is destroying him. She is actually destroying him." Victor finally pushed a piece forward, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Alara leaned in, her eyes scanning the board with calm certainty. Her hand moved slowly, and she placed her queen in a spot that made the air crackle with tension. Gasps spread across the hall like a wave, every spectator recognizing the brilliance of her foresight. Victor's jaw dropped, his hand froze in midair as he realized the queen now ruled the board, leaving him cornered once again. He sank back in his chair, beads of sweat dripping down his forehead, his confidence broken. Still Alara remained silent, her face expressionless, as if the game was no more than a quiet routine. Victor muttered something under his breath, his voice shaky, the sound swallowed by the stillness around him. The Grandmaster, who once mocked her, now looked like a student humbled before a teacher. The clock ticked on, each second cutting deeper into Victor's pride. Alara adjusted a piece of her hair behind her ear, her calmness contrasting sharply with the storm raging in Victor's mind. The crowd waited, eyes wide, hearts racing, the tension heavier than ever as Victor prepared to make his next trembling move. Victor finally reached for his knight, moving it with haste, as if speed alone could save him. The piece landed awkwardly, the move clumsy, lacking the precision of a grandmaster. A few spectators covered their mouths, trying to hide their shock. Others whispered that the great Victor was falling apart. Elara studied the board, her expression unchanged, her calm eyes tracing over every detail with ease. Then, with a smooth motion, she shifted her rook, sliding it across the board in a move so powerful that the silence deepened to stillness. Victor stared at the position, his lips parting, but no words coming forth, his arrogance now buried beneath disbelief. He pressed his palms flat against the table, his breath uneven, his once sharp posture slouched and defeated. The crowd leaned forward, some rising from their seats, unable to contain their anticipation. Elara remained steady, her hands folded, her gaze never leaving the board. The Grandmaster shook his head, muttering, it cannot be, but the board betrayed him with every glance. He tried to calculate, furiously moving invisible pieces in the air with his trembling fingers, but every imagined outcome ended the same. Elara had created a fortress around her king, and an iron grip around Victor's. The tension in the hall grew heavier every second until the air felt thick with silence. Victor finally lifted his queen and placed it forward with a sharp motion, his last desperate strike. The crowd murmured, some hopeful that the fight might turn, but others already seeing the trap unfold. Elara leaned slightly forward, her hand hovering with patience before she placed her bishop in perfect harmony, with her queen sealing the web even tighter. The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs once again, as Victor froze, his eyes wide with dread. Victor stared at the bishop, as though it were a blade pressed against his pride. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his mind struggling to find a thread of escape. The audience was silent again, the kind of silence that carried both awe and disbelief. Some of the younger players clutched their notebooks, wishing they could capture every detail of the strategy unfolding before them. Elara sat perfectly still, her presence calm, yet unshakable, her focus never leaving the board. Victor rubbed his forehead, his fingers digging into his skin as though pressure alone could summon an answer. He moved a pawn forward, a hollow gesture, a sign that he had run out of ideas. Elara responded with quiet certainty, her rook sliding across the board, the move clean and final in its intent. The crowd gasped louder this time, their voices echoing through the hall. She has him, they whispered. She has him completely. Victor's eyes widened as he realized what had happened, his pieces boxed in with nowhere to breathe. He shifted in his chair, leaning closer, his arrogance shattered, his face now marked only by disbelief and fear. Elara did not speak, her silence was heavier than any boast, her moves louder than any insult. The Grandmaster, who once mocked her, now looked cornered and frail, like a king with no soldiers left to command. The seconds on the clock ticked away, each one pushing Victor closer to collapse. The audience sat frozen, knowing they were witnessing something greater than a match. They were witnessing the fall of pride before the rise of brilliance. Victor licked his lips, his hand hovering above a piece, trembling as he tried to steady his breath before making another move. Victor's hand finally settled on his rook, and he pushed it forward in a clumsy attempt to shield his king. The sound of the piece striking the board echoed through the hall like a hollow drumbeat. The spectators leaned in closer, their eyes fixed on the quiet figure of Elara, who remained unshaken. Her gaze drifted slowly across the board, her calm presence commanding more respect than any speech ever could. Then, with a steady hand, she lifted her queen and placed it firmly in position. The crowd erupted in gasps. The trap was clear to all, even those who barely understood the game. Victor's face drained of color, his lips parting as he stared at the board, unable to accept the truth. He whispered no again and again, as if repeating the word could change what was already sealed. Elara leaned back, her movements soft, controlled, her silence still unbroken. The Grandmaster, who once mocked her, now trembled in front of everyone, his pride collapsing under the weight of her skill. Spectators exchanged looks of awe, some shaking their heads, others smiling at the quiet brilliance unfolding before them. The clock ticked relentlessly, its sound loud in the suffocating silence. Victor clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his eyes darting in desperate patterns, searching for a way to survive. Elara did not rush. She waited patiently, her stillness more powerful than any taunt. The The crowd could feel that the game was slipping further and further out of Victor's hands with each passing second. And yet he forced himself to move another piece, his desperation, clear his arrogance, now a shadow of what it once was. Victor slid his knight across the board, his fingers trembling as he released it. The move was rushed, unfocused, a sign of a man no longer playing with clarity, but with fear. The hall remained hushed, every eye fixed on the board, every breath caught between anticipation and disbelief. Alara studied the position, her calm eyes scanning with quiet certainty, as if she had already seen the ending long before the game began. She reached forward and moved her rook across the board, the motion smooth, deliberate, leaving no doubt of her command. Gasps rippled through the spectators as they saw the net tighten around Victor's king. Victor leaned closer, his face pale, his eyes wild, as he tried to recalculate the path of the game. But every line, every variation led to the same crushing truth. He looked up briefly, meeting Alara's eyes, and for the first time his arrogance was gone, replaced by the look of a man facing defeat. Alara did not flinch. She simply lowered her gaze back to the board, her focus unbroken, her silence louder than victory shouts. The clock ticked on, sharp and merciless, each second pulling Victor deeper into despair. The spectators shifted in their seats, some covering their mouths, others whispering to one another about the genius they were witnessing. Victor wiped the sweat from his brow, his pride fighting against the growing realization that he was powerless. He moved a pawn forward weakly, a gesture that only delayed the inevitable. Alara calmly advanced her queen once more, the piece gliding into position with the elegance of finality. The audience erupted in gasps again, a storm of disbelief and admiration filling the hall as Victor's king stood trapped more than ever before. Victor stared at the board, his eyes hollow, his pride crushed beneath the weight of inevitability. His fingers hovered above the pieces, but they no longer moved. The fight within him had gone silent. The once arrogant Grandmaster now looked broken before the quiet woman he had mocked so carelessly. Alara sat still, her calm face untouched by triumph or silence, deeper than any victory cry. The crowd waited, the air heavy with expectation, until Victor finally let out a long, trembling breath. He tipped his king forward, the soft sound of wood against wood echoing like thunder in the hall. Gasps filled the room, then cheers erupted, rising like a wave as the audience stood to their feet. The shy woman who had entered unnoticed was now the center of awe, her name whispered with reverence. Alara offered a small nod, her eyes lowering once again, as if victory was nothing more than a quiet step in her journey. Victor pushed back from the table, his head bowed, unable to meet her gaze, his arrogance dissolved into silence. The crowd swarmed around Alara, their admiration overflowing, yet she remained calm, humble, untouched by pride. For in her heart the game had never been about humiliating an opponent, it had always been about the beauty of chess itself. And so the hall remembered that day not as the fall of a grandmaster, but as the rise of a quiet brilliance that could no longer be ignored.